The Game Boy kinda sucks. Let me explain. The year's 1989. The NES has been delivering rich, deep gaming experiences for a few years at this point. But there was one problem. You couldn't take it out of the house. I mean, who wants to look at nature whenever you have Tetris? Enter the Game Boy. This brick of a handheld aimed to put the power of the NES in your palm. It used the unique dot matrix screen technology, which basically means the screen looks like vomit. You see, this was before the days of rechargeable batteries, meaning you had to slap 4 AA's into this thing to get it to work. So naturally, battery life was a major concern for Nintendo. Using a dot matrix screen meant they could double or even triple the battery life of the competitors. Unfortunately, this resulted in a very underwhelming screen. Everything had this gross, greenish tint to it, and on top of that, there wasn't even a backlight. Meaning if you wanted to play in the car, either you weren't, or you'd have to pull an illegal maneuver and turn on the overhead lights, blinding your dad and putting your whole family in danger. But that got me thinking, what if we could modify the classic handheld into something more playable? So I bought a cheap beat-up Game Boy off eBay for $30, and I'm gonna see if I can turn it into a competent modern handheld. To my surprise, the Game Boy actually showed up in fully working condition. It was listed as for parts and not working, but after playing with it for a little while, I didn't find anything wrong with it, besides some cosmetic issues. I'm sure you guys noticed, but the glass overlay that goes over the screen is missing. The shell's a little bit discolored, it's starting to yellow, but that's to be expected for something that is 40 years old at this point. And on the right side of the screen, there's a vertical line of dead pixels, which is actually pretty common with these really early Game Boys and should be a pretty easy fix. Our number one priority is going to be the screen. We could just replace the entire thing with a modern IPS panel, but then we lose the classic pixely look of the original screen, and it also costs more than I paid for the Game Boy itself, so I decided on installing a backlight onto the original screen panel. This is gonna let us play in the dark and make the screen look a million times better, all while being under $10. Next, I wanted to replace this old yellowed shell with an exciting color to give it a new and fresh feel. I decided on this nice turquoise color and these cool translucent buttons. Don't worry, I'm saving the original shell and buttons for another project in the future. But once we're all done with these modifications, we should have what feels like a brand new modern handheld. So I put my orders in and I waited. But after 2 long weeks, my supplies were finally here and I was ready to get to work. Our first course of action was to get this little guy installed. This is a bivert chip, and it's going to increase the contrast of the screen and make everything pop a little bit more. You can install the backlight without the bivert chip. It's not technically required, but do I look like a kind of lazy lowlife that would do that? Yeah, I mean, I am. If I wasn't doing the video, I probably would do that. The only issue with getting the bivert chip installed is that it requires a little bit of soldering, which I'm kind of dog shit at. It really doesn't help that I'm using this fire hazard disguised as a soldering iron. This was actually a wood burning kit from Joann's, but it gets hot, so I guess I'm gonna use this. So I found myself a nice, small, non-ventilated room to get to work in. And by the way, absolutely do not do this. Breathing in solder fumes is like really, really bad for you. I didn't even think about it while I was doing it. I was just sucking that stuff in. And believe me, I felt sick as a dog by the time I finished the project. I was ready to keel over. So if you're gonna do it, make sure you have some ventilation or like a fan running or something. Now, if you have soldering experience, this project really isn't too bad. Mine's very limited. So I had a lot of trouble getting a good connection between the board and the bivert chip, and it turns out the tip I picked was starting to deform from the heat. So once I switched that to a little bit of a thicker one, everything went a lot smoother and I got everything connected. I used the multimeter to check my connections and everything looked good. Now with our bivert chip installed, we can move over to the other half of the shell and start working on the screen. And believe me, if I knew what was in store, I would have quit right here. Like I mentioned before, there's 2 ways to upgrade the Game Boy screen. You can opt for an IPS panel and replace the entire screen assembly, which is super easy to do. It produces a really sharp, beautiful image. It has great pixel refresh rates and tons of customization options. They're really cool. I just wish they were my price range. Opting to install a backlight onto the original screen is a lot more cost effective. And personally, I'll inhale some solder to save a couple bucks. I mean, I got 2 lungs and only 1 chance to make this video, so I'd be stupid not to do it. And not only is this option cheaper, but it preserves the original screen. Like, we're actually modifying the original screen from the 80s, which I think is really cool, and it keeps that retro feel, which I think gives it a lot of charm. Or maybe, you know, I'm just trying to convince myself to save money. To get the backlight installed, I had to prep the screen first, which involved painstakingly peeling the reflector and the polarizer off the back of the screen. This took so long to do. There's some really fragile ribbon cables connecting the screen, so you can't pull it all the way off. So you really have a tiny area to kind of just chisel away at it. And you got to be careful because it's really easy to crack the screen as well whenever you're trying to peel it off. They really just lathered this thing in glue. I couldn't get the edge started, so I had to go grab a knife, which if you're doing this is probably not the best idea. It's not exactly the most finesse thing I could do, but I was able to pry up one of the corners enough to fit one of the plastic picks in my screwdriver set, and at that point it was just kind of a tedious thing of scraping all the glue and trying to peel that screen off without cracking anything or screwing anything up too bad. I did eventually get it all peeled off, but it left a lot of residue, so I had to spend the next hour rubbing away with a Q-tip covered in rubbing alcohol to try and get that all off there. Eventually I got everything looking squeaky clean, which meant it was time to get the backlight installed. I slid it behind the screen and I just soldered the negative wire to this capacitor down here, and then I soldered a positive wire to a resistor and then that onto the positive side of the capacitor. Now with all the soldering done, it was time to throw some batteries in, cross our fingers, and hope we get a nice clean light coming through. Fuck. Oh my god, you fucking idiot. Could I really have been this dumb? How could I let myself get so distracted? I've soiled the good name of my YouTube. Oh, it's fixed. Turns out all I had to do was spin the screen around, which did twist up the wires a little bit, which undoubtedly is going to be a problem in the future, but that's not a problem for me right now. Now with the backlight working, all that was left was to slap some of the polarizing film on the screen and get everything moved over to the new shell. Really, the only problem I had with this step was that you could really tell that the shell was from AliExpress. One, because it smelled like it was gonna give me cancer, and two, because it was kind of all warped. Like, it wasn't really fitting together perfectly. So I really had to force the screws in to get everything to kind of fit together nicely. But after a couple hours of work, some damaged lungs, and about $15, we were able to turn this old, grimy Game Boy into a sleek, modernized retro handheld. And now, I mean, the only thing left is to go show it off.
Hey, check out what I made.
It's very nice. What is it?
It's a Game Boy.